Thanks again, everyone, for coming and for sticking around for the discussion. And a big thanks to Arne and Dennis and Luc for agreeing to be a part of this small panel. And we'll open it up to questions also afterwards, or if you want to jump in at any point, raise your hand. We will try to get a mic back to you. So just to jump right in, because I know Arne has places to be soon, I'll just do a quick introduction of the three here. We have Dennis Mohr, whose film you've just finished watching. He is an award-winning documentary film producer and director and the founder of Public Pictures. The documentary Mugshot premiered at Hot Docs back in 2014 and was nominated for a Canadian Screen Award, and also received a Yorkton Film Festival Golden Sheaf Award for Best Arts and Culture Documentary. He's also produced a number of other feature documentaries, including Remembering Arthur, Dis Farmer, Portrait of America, and The Ravenite, a very antisocial social club. He can tell us more about some of his current projects maybe in a bit. Arne Svenson, who's also featured in the film and has some work on show in the exhibition, which I hope you will take a moment to look at after. Is a self-taught photographer with an educational and vocational background in special education. His photos have been shown extensively in the US, Europe, and Asia, and his work is included in numerous public and private collections, including SF MoMA, the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston, and the Carnegie Museum of Art. He's also the author of numerous books, including Unspeaking Likeness, The Neighbors, Prisoners, pictured here, and Sock Monkeys. Recent exhibitions include The Neighbors at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Denver in 2016, and André Cortez, Arne Svenson, à ma fenêtre in the Galerie Miranda in Paris, which was just this last year. And finally, we have Luc Sante, who is a writer and a critic, and whose work you might be familiar with as a frequent contributor to the New York Review of Books. He's also the author of numerous books, including Low Life, Lures and Snares of Old New York, Evidence, The Factory of Facts, Walker Evans, Kill Your Darlings, Pieces, 1990 to 2005, and The Other Paris. And he currently teaches writing and the history of photography at Bard. So thanks again so much for being here. He was also in the documentary, as you may recognize. So just to start out, I guess I'd like to pose a question to Dennis. I know it's been a while since you put out the film, but maybe you can tell us what your entry point was to this kind of wide-reaching subject of the mugshot, and if you had a sense from the beginning, I guess, how you wanted to approach all the different sort of dimensions in its realm of kind of pop culture and media and art and society, or if that sort of took shape as you did your research.
Yeah, I guess it's been 5 years. I haven't seen it in probably about 4, but I remember being at a film festival in Arkansas and stopping into a gas station and picking up a Slammer, a copy of the Slammer, thinking, this is outrageous. So I thought I'd read this on the plane. And I took that back with me and I kept it on my desk for quite a while. And then I came across a photo book, Mark Michelson's, the Least Wanted book, and I remember thinking, wow, that's odd, like new mugshots, old mugshots, there's gotta be something there, and I was looking for a new project. Sent out a couple emails, and I got, I think the first one back from Luc, and the second one from Arne, and the third one from Mark. And I just kind of built it around that, saying, I don't know really much about this. I'm fascinated. Why am I fascinated? And then as a documentary filmmaker, I just became the messenger and kind of let these people explain it to me. Turned on a camera and traveled around. It was very small, made for public television in Canada. That's why we have the Canadian content in there. And it was kind of fascinating on our side of the fence, what the Americans were doing with these things, and we're more in a European kind of legal system. Really had no ideas or opinions about it. I just kind of went in a van with my cinematographer and met all these people, so that's pretty much it.
What was it like to gain access to the kind of inner workings of these publications like The Slammer and The Smoking Gun that kind of trade in the humiliation of other people, or as Cornetti puts it, create lighthearted embodiments of local crime? And were you concerned at any point about giving voice to them and how to kind of balance that?
Yeah, it's a good question. Obviously, people like Arne and Luc And Mark didn't really have anything, that's going to expose him in any way. It's just, cultural, historical, sociological, photography research. Isaac was the only one I worried about, and it took me about 3 months just to gain his trust. Even when we went down to interview him, we still had to take him to dinner and discuss what we were going to do. I think he realized we were pretty much unassuming and just telling a story once he met us in person. But you had to tiptoe around that. He was trying to get out of the business as we were interviewing him. He had just had his first child, and what was interesting is, his life was kind of turning around. He didn't really want to be the king of mugshots. The writing was on the wall then that the laws were changing, and he just wanted to get into regular business. And it's funny because of all the people that I've always kept tabs on, even coming here, I noticed that he actually liked the fact that we were having this event. So it's kind of funny that to this day I'm still kind of like, wonder what he would think. But anyway, so that was the only person. Of course, the people in the mugshots, like the children, when we were at the facility shooting at the jail or that facility, we were concerned about showing their mugshots. And I really did, with the fingerprint specialist, Sam Penica, discuss a lot of, the kind of implications of that. So he gave me good guidance as well. And the fellow you see at the end there, getting his mugshot taken, I had a discussion with him. He was cool with everything. He even signed a release, and I explained everything to him. I mean, it's funny, you don't get to see these kinds of things, behind the scenes. But again, I was quite careful about everybody and made sure that I had the blessing. I'm, non-confrontational, so it's. I made sure I kind of crossed all those T's and dotted all those I's.
I wanted to touch on the kind of optics of nostalgia that the gallerist Stephen Bulger brings up in the film, and that Arne kind of describes as the ye old filter that kind of permits this sort of useful or maybe problematic kind of distance from the subjects. And kind of how do you think the feeling of historical distance, which I guess is in part an effect of the aesthetic quality of the images, affects our alienation from or identification with the pictured subject? And do you think this ends around the 60s, as Mark Michelson suggests, that's kind of the last really interesting and artistic period for mugshots? Or do you think this kind of nostalgizing effect is something that is sort of endlessly renewing in the way that Diarmaid Mogg mentions, with the idea that the slammer in 100 years might be this amazing, historical artifact? That's to whomever has a thought.
It comes down to the faces, and the fact is that the better the photographs, the more revealing they are of the faces that they capture, the less the nostalgia trap is there, I think. So Arne's pictures, there are 5 examples from prisoners here. They're eternal, these are people. Sure, they're wearing clothes and hats. You don't see much nowadays, maybe, but nevertheless, they are in the room. And that's something that happens with not all that many mugshots. It's a kind of test case for portrait photography, that mugshots can look like they were taken by a machine. And then you have Clara Smith, or you have what didn't get covered in a movie because Dennis was restricted to North America, but the great mugshots put out by the Police Department of New South Wales in Sydney, and some of those are just extraordinary portraits, and they go beyond crime, really, beyond the circumstances they're making. There's a lot of variation between. The fact is that kind of photographic initiative, I think, where you have a photographer who's hired by the police department to take mugshots, but somehow slips the bounds and makes some kind of contact, because that's what the necessary fact. It's not just skill, it's contact between the photographer and the subject, something that goes both ways. And the more recent mugshots in the Slammer or whatever, or on the Smoking Gun, they just look like they're taken by some automatic apparatus. And who, you know, the subject may be drunk, perfectly sober, out of their minds, but they're sort of not there. And in any event, they could be, you know, they're just being processed. They're not being portrayed.
And I think that it's, Mrs. Smith was photographing humans, and I think contemporary mugshot photographers are photographing objects. I think it's an assembly line where you are not learning anything, and you're not supposed to learn anything about them. You're just supposed to be able to identify them. Mrs. Smith, whether through design or by accident, was able to get past that objectivity and into the subjectivity of the subject, and that we can understand that these people breathe and that there's blood running through their systems. I don't think that we see that in contemporary mugshots at all. I don't. You know, what attracted me to these, by the way, was not the writing that she did, it was the actual portrait. This is all about portraiture to me. And had they not had the names, they wouldn't have been quite as enticing, but I think they would have, in a way, been enticing in a different way. So your imagination could have gone, you know, you could have taken your imagination and run with it. And again, I don't think the contemporary ones have that. And I think it's a way that they're also reproduced. You know, and it's just, if they're in print, there's like a, you know, the dot pattern is just breaking up so much that you just have features and kind of a silhouette. Whereas this camera was an incredible machine, you know. Oh, by the way, I just want to say, these are the blow-up of an actual negative. It's one negative. She had a sliding back on her camera, so she would make the exposure, slide it, and then make the other exposure, develop it, and then she would write in reverse writing on the back of it, the name of the criminal and the crime. So these are exactly as I found them, but in positive form.
And can you tell us a little bit about what your research process entailed as you went about trying to dig up the stories of the pictured individuals?
You mean the thing that aged me like 10 years? You know. I found them in 95, I think. I found like 10 in an antique store, and then as I said in the movie, I tracked down all of them, you know, that I could get at 1,500. And at first I was satisfied with just having the images, and the names were incidental, but then I thought, I've been given too much and I have to take advantage of this. So I presumed where they had been taken, which is this little town, Marysville, in California, because that's where they had been found. And so I tracked down where they were found, and they'd been stored in a stairwell of the Oddfellows Hall, but there were thousands of them. Ultimately, I found that there had been 6,000 of these, and they'd been dispersed, but I got 1,500. Anyway, once I found out where they were stored, the town, then I found out who took the pictures, and that was Mrs. Smith, who was the town photographer. From there, I thought, okay, I know who the photographer is, I know where they were taken. Went to the courthouse and said, do you have any extant records of this? And they had one book. They'd thrown everything else in the dumpster, but they had one book, which was the felonies from like 1860 to 1920. So I had a list, I had 500 prisoners. I had a list that I cross-referenced the names in the book, in the log book. But that was only, I think, 70 of them, because everybody else was petty larceny or disturbing the peace. And the only records that I found anywhere were the actual newspapers. There was 2 newspapers that came out daily, each with 8 pages. So I dutifully had my list. This was, by the way, Google was invented in 1997, and this was 96. All right, and so there was none of that nonsense. This was, this was me in Marysville staying at the Yuba City Motor Inn. for like a week or two at a time. So anyway, I ended up in the library where they had all the newspapers. I couldn't afford microfilm. So they had the actual newspapers. So cross-reference, I just started with, in 1900, and then turned the pages for 8 years. And would look for identifying, kind of signifiers of crime or disturbance or something, and then I would get the name, and I would cross-reference it with my list, and then I would go from there. And that took, going back and forth, took 2 years, I guess. And the papers were disintegrating in my hand. They just were being destroyed. But there was no one in the library except the homeless. And I asked the librarians, who were these saints, I said, do you mind? I said, I feel terrible that I'm destroying these papers. And they said, you're the only one that cares about these. And so they would open up the library an hour or two early so I could come. And the price of admission was I had to tell them stories about New York every morning. and about my life in New York, which I eventually ran out of exciting things, so I would make them up. Of like, oh yeah, I went out with so-and-so and so-and-so, and we stayed out for 3 nights, and they're like, So, but that's what it cost me, was just a few lies, and they gave me donuts, and so that was my research.
And can you just tell us how kind of Unspeaking Likeness, which is the project that's briefly mentioned in the film, evolved sort of out of this work? Or was it sort of directly inspired, or was it more the ethos of kind of sensitivity that you carried with you into that?
I think it was the latter. I discovered, with my friend Laura Lindgren over there, who's the publisher, by the way, with Ken Sweezy, of Prisoners, we were in the Mutter Museum in Philadelphia, Museum of Pathology, and I found a head, sculpture of a head, of a woman with glasses and a wig, just kind of leaning like this, and found out it was a forensic facial reconstruction. And I'm sure you all know what they are, that when they find a skeleton where the soft tissue has decomposed, and the person's unidentified, artists will build a face based on scientific averaging of skin depth and so on onto it. It'll be photographed by the cops and released so that you can identify that person. I felt that was a terrible disservice to the murdered person. They were almost all murdered. So I set about to reanimate. A lot of my work is about that, reanimating. Same with this. Exactly, that's the thread. Even the crazy sock monkeys, it's the same thing. It's bringing something back to life, even in a very short lifespan. But so I went around the country finding facial forensic facial reconstructions, and would photograph them as if they were real people. And I used a 4x5 camera, and they're just the neck and the head. But I would build a body. With anything from toilet paper rolls to candy bars, whatever, and pile them up, and then put my clothes on them and shoot them from here up, so it would look like they were. It was reinstating dignity to them. I mean, they were terrible tales of what had happened to these people, and I wanted to take time back and give them some kind of semblance of the visceral breath of life. So that's like kind of the connective tissue between that. And also the way I shot them was almost exactly the way that Mrs. Smith. I was lighting the same way that she was lighting. So she has been my, for a kind of a matronly grandma figure, she's been my muse, in like sensible shoes.
So thinking about the different approaches that were taken by the kind of primary artists in the film, so Arne and also Mark Michelson and Diarmaid Maug, and also by Dennis, I guess, in the making of the film itself. When you're appropriating mugshots and reconceiving them within an artistic framework, what is your responsibility to your subjects?
Again, I kind of relied on the people who held these to give me advice, and I figured while they published them, exhibit them. You know, they're influenced by them, and we're just kind of asking them what they do with them. So I figured, you know, they're the ones with these mugshots, so I guess it's okay to show them, to put them out. Again, I discussed this with everybody from, you know, Arne to, I guess, Mark, you know, Stephen Kasher, Daramid, and, you know, everybody was good with it. Even that cop that you see in, you know, the town. So again, I'm kind of a cautious filmmaker. I just, you know, I'd kind of cleared that with everyone beforehand. I did look into, you know, what the implications, and I ran it by the entertainment lawyer and all that. So I mean, it was all kind of cleared. And again, like I said, in the prison system, you know, I probably even belabored it too much with people, such as Sam, but I was given the go-ahead, and I guess that's part of the project. With the editor, we worked together, and with the producers, and the researchers, and always kind of put our heads together saying, you know, should this be in the film? Should we show this? And I think all the way through to the end, now that I think about it, we were as cautious as could be, if that answers your question.
I guess what I'm wondering is, you know, compared to someone like Mark Michelson, who was operating more clearly within a kind of gallery and fine art context, can anyone actually, you know, own a mugshot? And, you know, is it ethical to sell those images on the commercial art market, for example? Is that fundamentally different from the kind of profiting that the slammer does? You know, what are the kind of differences in terms of contextualization? You know, how should we understand that?
Right. Now that I think about it, I kind of see one of the issues that I had was, like, are we showing, like, you know, serial killers here? I asked Mark, like, these beautiful, quote-unquote, graphic images of these people, like, you know, murdered children, you know, or are they rapists? You know, how do you curate your collection? Most people, such as him, you know, told me that that's kind of filtered out, which is also another kind of dilemma we faced. You know, well, shouldn't we include those dastardly characters too? I guess that's why we kind of brought up Arne's story as well. That was the only thing I was kind of uncomfortable with. We may never know, because some of these things are selected just purely for their farcical kind of nature, such as Smoking Gun. I did actually do some background checks on people that I interviewed, and I found some surprising things as well. I'll keep that to myself. But, you know, you are dealing with all sorts of histories. Whether they're dastardly or not, I don't know all the details. You know, someone like Daramid knows all the details, but example, when I asked him about how many people have come back, you know, scolding you for this website, very, very few. You know, you could count on one hand, you know, after all these years. So I just found that most people seem to be fascinated by them, not just purely for the entertainment value, but, as they say, for the historical. So the artistic value, I'm kind of on the fence about that. I think the graphic nature, and I think Mark's spot on about that, and he makes no bones about that. You know, the cultural aspect that Kasher brings up and what Luc defines, I think it's just, I guess I'm going back to what I thought is really a fascinating subject. I really have no idea or opinions about it after all these years, come to think about it. I think your exhibition probably frames it where the film leaves off, and there's more to talk about after this. I mean, this is just kind of headlines of all these issues. So I hope that answers your question.
But are you asking, does an artist have a right to call this art? Is that what you're, I mean, is
well,
that
I guess
kind of...
I'm wondering also what you felt, for example, your responsibility was coming to, you know, an archive that already existed with works in it that weren't necessarily, you know, that fundamentally were situated within a kind of juridical context initially, and, you know, were pictures of people who were obviously generally quite down and out. You know, more to ask what you felt your responsibility was, perhaps, to the subjects.
My responsibility was the truth.
Yeah.
And that's why I had to pursue, once I had the name and the crimes, was to allow them to tell their tales, but again, in this really, really tiny time frame. You know, from the time they were arrested to the time they were photographed. and then went to trial. That's all I know about these lives. And I think by using the original negatives, and even with all the damage on them that had happened when they were stored in terrible places, that I do, because I paid respect, that I do have and did have the right. And none of this is about humiliation. I think a lot of the ones of funny faces or painted faces are about humiliation, and they're stupid. But this, I think, is allowing them to come and tell their story, which transcends that, I think.
Another thing not to forget in a completely different way is that these people, and most of the world of historical mugshots, talking up to maybe the 50s, 60s, they did not live in a surveillance society. And in fact, the further back you get, and the more actually criminal they are, the town of Newcastle, Pennsylvania does seem to be a steady thing there. But on the other hand, I'm thinking of, I mentioned Australia. There's a great book of mugshots called Crooks Like Us by Peter Doyle, which is all the Australian mugshots. And he talks about the fact that, personal identity was a much less set thing then. And, he picks up on the fact that there were people who were photographed in mugshots like maybe 4 or 5 times over the years, and he had a different last name every time. You could disappear, you could reinvent yourself, you could tell tales about your past that were completely made up. Nobody would challenge you, nobody would care. So, it was the self that was presented to the camera when you were arrested that time, by a couple of years later would be some other self. So, it's, you're not, I suppose there is the remote possibility that was my grandfather and he was an honest man, God damn it. But most of the time, these are a phase. These are episodes, they're stories, rather than, and there is a person there, but it's liquid.
And certainly it makes a big difference that these images existed before the era of the internet, where they could follow people, or at least there would be that kind of association between the name and the image that, obviously has changed the nature of the kind of criminal record today, in any case.
Also, just to be reminded, these are actually booking photographs, so you're not necessarily guilty in any of these photos. So that's just, another thing that people to be reminded.
History makes you guilty.
Right. That's a good point.
But every one of these could have been innocent, because they were booked and charged and then brought over to Mrs. Smith's. So this particular group pretty much did, except Mr. Lovelet, the rape, didn't do what his label there said he did. But he's damned to eternity.
Right, and a lot of a big theme of the show for those who've seen it or who haven't is kind of to examine that stigma of guilt that's carried with the mugshot format itself, kind of regardless of charge or conviction, and the evolution that took place in the history of the actual taking of the booking photograph, because there was a long period, kind of from the 1850s, New York, where only hardened repeat offenders would be photographed, with the understanding that there was such a damaging association that you had to be certain that this person was a professional criminal and not just someone who was a sort of casual one-time offender. So, what else do you want to talk about?
Maybe they will.
Maybe someone else wants to talk. I guess one thing I wanted to ask Luc as well, since you've done kind of related work, in a sense, with a lot of the books that you've written about kind of conveying larger histories through the narratives of sort of deliberately obscure individuals, often kind of ne'er-do-well types on the fringes of society. Maybe you can just tell us a little about your interest in the kind of lost histories that provide a sort of different lens, maybe through which to understand a kind of historical narrative, and maybe how you position yourself as well as a writer in relation to those subjects.
It came out of several things. It came out of living in New York, which I did from the early 70s until the dawn of the 21st century. It was a very different place then, and you'd see all kinds of people, and go to Port Authority, and you'd see the whole spectacle of all of humanity passing before your eyes. Interested in the lives of the poor and what their concerns were and how they fell outside of history. And that's my whole family, both sides. And, nobody graduated from high school in my family. So I was interested in, what history would look like from the other side of the sidewalk. In various places, living in tenement buildings, wondering who the original 10 sets of tenants were, etc. So, it's all about humanity when it hasn't been coached, it hasn't been art directed, it hasn't been selected by a jury. And how little of that there is really when you're talking about the 19th century or even stretches of the 20th, that, lack of photo documentation. And then it turns out that, I did a book of NYPD crime scenes called Evidence, pictures taken between 1914 and 1918, and I was drawn to them not by the fact that they were crime scenes so much as that they documented how people lived at that time. And there were, aside from handful of photographs by, Jacob Rees, Lewis Hine, Jesse Tarbuck Spiels. These were documentation of how people furnished their rooms, where they put their beds, what they put on the walls, how they dressed, what their attitudes were, and all these things. And, likewise, if I were going to write a book about the way men wore hats in the 20th century, I would start there, right? There's so much besides crime. It's just that crime, this kind of registry of humans didn't exist in any other context back then. I guess it's, if you want to put it that way, it's the beginnings of the surveillance society, and look where we are now. Nevertheless, the value in documenting what history with a capital H overlooked for so long. Now there are academics working on these things, but for a long, long time, these were neglected, and only the police really was interested enough to record the lives or afterlives of these people who slipped through life, leaving very little documentation. And anyway, so I'm babbling at this point.
In the film, you also mentioned, the way in which people are publicly ridiculed and exploited for cheap entertainment as kind of fitting into the reality culture of today, where people also, at the same time, often invite that kind of publicity. And there's also an instance where Isaac Cornetti mentions people calling up the slammer, to see if they can get on the front page. So kind of inverse of what we've been talking about too, which is obviously people who end up becoming public, against their will. But I just was thinking, I read something you'd written a while ago about the kind of public spectacle that surrounded the FBI's 10 Most Wanted, and then that became the New York's 13 Most Wanted later, and the way in which criminals at that time already were vying for the top spots. I made that up. It's fiction, that story. Is it totally
fiction? In case
fiction?
you hadn't noticed, yeah.
Never mind. Do you think though that there has really been, a distinct change to the public's actual relation to crime and its representation sort of in the contemporary age, if that kind of performativity is really something new, or if criminality maybe has always sort of contained that element.
Well, the thing about, public consumption of mugshots, don't forget, the only time people, well, yeah, I mean, I see that there are the displays from police headquarters in like the 1890s there, and those beautiful wooden cabinets. But generally speaking, in the 20th century, you'd go to the post office and there'd be the federal wanted posters tacked up to the bulletin board, which I don't think they have anymore. And that was really most of the public's knowledge of mugshots. Regular and police department mugshots would not be circulated to the general public. And I only started noticing this phenomenon of, people looking at mugshots of, crazy drunk people on the Smoking Gun, when that became a website, I don't know, early in the 21st century. And I don't even know if it's still around. Is it still around?
I think so.
Yeah. Well, anyway, it's probably still going on, but it was much more of a focus before crime on parade became a national thing in the last couple of years. But I hadn't seen that before. And then the slammer and its analogs, there are various. I remember seeing those in California too. I mean, those were a phenomenon of the early 2000s. They undoubtedly still go on, but the novelty factor has waned. And there was really no opportunity for people to gape at criminals before then, in real life. That kind of, I mean, unless you want to go back to the medieval city and the public stocks and stuff like that.
There was the TV show Cops.
Yeah, well, that's true too. Yeah.
But actually, in some of the research that I did, what I was surprised to uncover actually was that in many of the very early rogues galleries that existed in the U.S., a part of the sort of process of putting up those portraits for display was not just for use as an internal sort of tool for law enforcement, but they also did invite the public to pass through, and it actually became a kind of form of entertainment for people to come the same way that you might go and visit like a gallery. People would come, and I think there was a certain sense of spectatorship and superiority alongside it that was the purview of the upper classes already kind of in the mid-19th century.
Thomas Burns's Professional Criminals of America, 1881.
Yeah, well, exactly. And he was probably, Thomas Burns was the chief detective of the NYPD from 1880 to 95, and he brought about quite a significant change to the nature of mugshots and kind of ushered in sort of an era of quite distinct like antagonisms sort of towards the criminal. And there's a few pictures of his over there, or actually they've moved behind us now, but they'll be back out later, from his book Professional Criminals of America, which was kind of the first sort of portable rogues gallery. And he became very fixated on the idea that you could really sort of indubitably and irrevocably capture the criminal in a photograph, and that would prevent them from ever being able to kind of elude, the police's grasp again, because you had traced the contours of their face, and you had captured them in this sort of permanent manner, kind of obviously sort of overlooking the fact that people certainly age or, can wear disguises, but so I think, there certainly was an evolution in the attitude in the United States in particular regarding sort of criminals and criminal suspects' rights, because one of his big innovations was photographing the suspects as well as the convicted criminals, which has remained common practice, so to this day, which obviously raises quite a few sort of ethical implications about what it means, to have that kind of record public, particularly in the digital era, where those things can linger for a lifetime and then some.
One of my great regrets in life is that I don't have a copy of my own mugshot. I was arrested with a group of kids when we were 17, 1972, for disturbing the peace. And by the time I figured out that I could get my mugshot, it would pass like the 10-year limit or whatever, upon which time they destroy them. So, damn. Then I'd use that as my author photo. You know.
Someone will find it in a dumpster somewhere.
You'll be. I was just going to add, talking about this. I read somewhere that Thomas Burns, when he died, they found a big collection of pulp fiction novels, like Wild Tales of the Wild West and whatnot, under his bed, and they figured that he was always interested in kind of making these into larger stories. So I forgot that one of my original fascinations about this subject was tied to my fascination with the Newgate Calendar, which is the beginnings of crime fiction. And when they realized, back in England, that these wanted kind of stories and posters and tales, that the public would eat them up, and began the story of fiction, I kind of thought that Thomas Burns was interesting, that there were some theories that he wanted to turn his writing into something more sensational and cash in on that kind of thing. And then the other story that I thought was fascinating, which I've told you before, is that Jeannie Tooman, who's in the film, had this interesting article, which we could never find, or I could never get from her. She went somewhere else afterwards, but it was an article in a New York paper around the turn of the century, editorial that was moralizing about young women who would come in and spend too much time perusing these galleries, and saying that it's not very good to have this out in public because there they are looking at these criminals and they weren't sure what their motives were. And then my mind jumped to that modern day Jeremy Meeks character who was all over the news and ended up becoming a reality TV star, I suppose. You remember that one?
Yeah, the hot convict.
And my fascination with history is that, gosh, we're not that much different than we were, 100 years ago or 1,000 years ago or whatnot. So I think that's what kind of drove me into these stories. You couldn't include it all into the film. And then one other thing that just popped to mind just talking about this is Darren had always said that, I asked him about what makes a great collection of mugshots, and he said his theory was, I think that if it's like an American collection from any town, any time, is that you have a collection of people, obviously they're the everyday people, so that's interesting, one, but they have to come from a great culture. He said, think about if you found a cache of mugshots from Rome. You'd flip, because there's something that he thought was maybe tied to kind of great cultures and whatnot. So I never really kind of processed that, but I just thought it was an interesting topic for discussion.
His work also kind of interested me because I thought it offered an interesting complement to Arne's in that quite a different way, but where the kind of traditionally antagonistic relationship between law enforcement and the criminal became much more sympathetic, during that period of severe economic depression in Newcastle, and that the cop that you see pictured there mentions that it was this kind of different type of law enforcement because everyone was sort of down and out.
There's a funny story about that, and I kind of sympathize with him, even though he's kind of a dastardly character, and I won't go into why he was, kicked off the force. But he said, look, back in the old day, you forget, like in the 40s, 50s, when he was a young patrolman, you didn't have backup. You couldn't just radio somebody. You were out on the beat alone. You were scared to death. You weren't necessarily bigger or tougher than these guys. Yes, you had a gun, but you had to be careful. And he said, all you had to do is you would capture somebody, and if they put up a fight, you'd have to beat them down, handcuff them to the nearest post, and then you'd have to walk a few blocks to a call box to call for backup. And so he insisted that, a lot of the nightstick beatings and the bandages that you see in the photographs were, to protect himself until he could get help. There's some truth in that, I think, but then I think back to the Blood and Guts book, that was another story.
It's interesting with Mr. Brown up there resisting an officer, because this is also a story of a town, and the town is Marysville, and it was founded in 1850, right during the gold rush. It was a very prosperous town. And in around 1906 to 1910, it started kind of turning, and most of these people are transients that are coming through. kind of 50 years too late for the gold rush, but they were mining gold still, you know, a little bit. And they were doing a lot of ranching, but it went from the kind of prosperous town to what is now, or when I was working there, was the methamphetamine capital of California, and it's just is a dive. But Mr. Brown there was resisting an officer. He was a man that was drinking in town, and he was spotted by a cop, and the cop started chasing him, and Mr. Brown started running. And then another cop saw him running and started chasing and waving a gun. And the headline in the paper was, "Great entertainment had by all in town, watching Negro run, you know, from policemen." And the last paragraph said, had you mentioned a rope and a noose to Mr. Brown, he would have run twice as fast. So the assumption is, and it was an appropriate assumption on Mr. Brown's part, was that he could be lynched. You know, so you got to bring that into it. You know, it kind of, that's the history of that town also, and that's a perfect example. You know, and that's absolutely why he ran.
I think in that sense, obviously historical context and the nature of the charge becomes quite important. I think back behind the screen as well, you have the work by the artist Eric Etheridge called Breach of Peace, which relates to the crime that a lot of the freedom riders were charged with when they were arrested for protesting segregation in a lot of public terminals and on the buses across the United States. And so obviously in that case, you know, it also is kind of a matter of that like slippery criminal designation. You know, there are these slightly dubious, you know, phrases that come around, like breach of peace and resisting an officer, disturbing the peace,
right,
you know.
He was just being drunk, but then
Yeah.
it became something else in the context of the town.
Right.
You know, and of the observers. This was the entertainment on that particular Saturday afternoon in Marysville.
Yeah. And becomes a kind of self-reinforcing, you know, criminalization of, you know, certain groups as well, obviously. I just wanted to ask Dennis one thing. I remembered in an earlier exchange we had, you'd mentioned to me that one of the areas you wish you'd explored more in the film was the cooperation between New York State and Ontario police in the kind of cross-border criminals that were documented by the OPP.
Just briefly, is
Mugshot
that
collection.
between Ontario, I think Hamilton area, and New York, a lot of these criminals in that collection, for example, cross borders, changed names, grew up in front of the camera, you know, crime after crime. And it was interesting because it's one of the first areas that shared criminal information back and forth, and mugshots as well. So it was kind of is a little bit, you know, diversion to put in the film, but I thought that was an interesting bit. Like, so it's the first kind of international or exchange, if you will, you know, between using mugshots and the card information cards between the two.
When would that have been then?
Gosh, I guess like 1880s, or
I
it
was
was
wondering
probably
what
around the
form,
Thomas
yeah.
Burns era, I think.
Yeah.
It was pretty much at the beginning of using the mugshots and the ID cards. And of course, because people had to track these people, they would go from state fairs in New York to ones in, you know, Ontario and back and forth. These are cross-criminal kind of, you know, people that they wanted to keep track of.
Does anybody else want to ask any questions now? I'd like to open it up to the crowd. Here, conveniently close.
What is the derivation of the term mug for face? And relatedly, when did the term mugshot become used for these photographs? Was there an earlier term like suspect photo or police rendering or whatever it might be? So the derivation of those two terms, mug and mugshot.
I'm sure that's a question for Luc, but the thing I heard is that it came from the Toby mug in England, where they used to put your face on a mug.
Toby jug.
The jug, right? And I don't know if that's true or not, so.
It could be rhyming slang. You know. Yeah, mug, you know, pan, all these old term, old slang terms for the face. I really don't know, and I'm embarrassed, and I should look this up.
Mugging for the camera.
Mugshot, and nobody knows of an earlier term from mugshot.
Not for the specific shot.
Yeah.
There was a rogues gallery, of course, but,
Right.
but for the specific shot.
I don't think they were called mug shots in the early days of the rogues galleries, certainly. They were
No.
more criminal portraits.
I think mugshots is probably a tabloid one,
Yeah.
probably starting in the 20s.
Yeah, Mrs. Smith didn't refer to them as mugshots. They were the prisoner photo.
No, and Thomas Burns doesn't either, so I think, it must have come around much later.
I like Rogues Gallery. That's my choice.
It's a very chic term at the moment. Yes?
So when you were questioning earlier about the ethical parts of whether or not you should show the faces or choose to show the faces, I also wondered a little bit about rights and usage kind of stuff. I was thinking particularly about the Shepard Fairey case where he was sued by the photographer who took the photograph because he made a painting based on the photograph. So obviously the photographers in most of these cases wouldn't necessarily consider themselves artists or even be alive to want the rights to them, but maybe, I don't know if that comes into play at all.
Well, the only pictures where you have, Mrs. Smith, for example, where you have a freelance photographer, they're already in the public domain anyway. And then anything after that, they're government property. We're down to an individual copyright. So if, the city of New York wants to go after you for using a mugshot from, taken in 1929, then, but I suppose it could happen in this day and age, but I've never heard of such a thing.
But an individual that was arrested and photographed 2 months ago could, right, Ken? Couldn't they?
Photographer or
The photographer photographed. I mean, if they use a mugshot from 2 months ago, could the subject sue?
the subject has been arrested, so not convicted. I don't know. That'd be defamation or something. Unless it's
Right.
I don't know. No. I don't think about the subject shouldn't be able to sue. It might be later if it's misused, like if someone.
If you think about the Warhol things, what if someone today took a picture from the smoking gun and painted it and made it a piece with that?
It's funny because one of the ridiculous circles I got in is the Warhol Foundation is notorious for keeping rights on his work, and so I'm saying, wait a second here. They were actually quite good with me. They didn't seem to even want to get into it, but I thought, well, I'm using in the film. We were so careful, like I said, cautious. All that stuff that you see of those recreated things, we actually cut out the original photos from the police pamphlet that we did borrow from the Warhol Museum, and then recreated what he did in the film just to be on the safe side. And it was kind of funny. And then I said, wait a second. I said, he just took these out of a pamphlet anyway, so this is kind of ridiculous. I'm not paying or even going to consider that. And they never really expected me to, and they were very, very helpful at the Warhol thing. So I just thought it was kind of a silly kind of argument because it did bring in all these kind of issues. And I forgot that the very beginnings of this film, I was interested in, I thought there was going to be one or two great mugshot photographers. And I thought, oh, great, there's going to be these guys, and we're going to follow them, and there's going to be a history. And then I found very quickly that there's no such thing. They're all just conscripted. They do their shift. Each policeman rotates through. Then I was relieved after I spoke to my lawyer, saying, well, that's good because that answers that question. We'll never have to worry about rights from any kind of, law enforcement officer, even though he's being paid by tax dollars to do so. So it was kind of, that point, I think I kind of said, just show what, people have in their collection and don't worry about it.
Yeah, every sort of standard mugshot that I've encountered, especially within the United States, has fallen under public domain law. What is an interesting point of contrast is just that in Europe, for example, where you have the right to be forgotten, policy, which of course we have nothing like because of the First Amendment, you do have the right to petition Google and other search engines to have a mugshot or other aspects of your criminal record removed. And so you couldn't necessarily sue, but you can petition based on various kinds of claims like expungement or defamation, similarly, which obviously raises questions about American privacy laws and why it is that we've allowed the First Amendment to keep that information in the public domain. But on the other hand, Europe is running into problems in enforcing the right to be forgotten as well, because obviously having Google as the kind of grand arbiter of those decisions is not uncomplicated in itself, and who should be the one to make those judgment calls, basically, is the question of today.
So I'd like to say a couple of things. Well, first of all, I think did you do the writing?
Oh yes, that's me.
Brilliant.
Oh, thank you.
I'm so glad I read it before it's all began. So,
Thanks.
Sorry,
anyway, oh my God, what is this? Where? All right. Sorry.
Caught on me.
What a production. Anyway,
Could have just yelled it out.
what lit me up, and I was thinking about it, was Luc's saying, using the word surveillance, to lift this whole topic into our time. Because I was thinking that what we now have is we're constantly surrounded, by cameras, right? Everywhere. So now we're on the camera, being photographed as potential criminals. And so a lot of these videos, because we walked over from Avenue A here, and we walked through Astor Place and Broadway, and got on the R train, and got off at Canal Street and walked through here. So we were probably filmed, photographed, maybe 100 times from what we hear. So, because this whole thing about, who owns our image, right? There's a lot of discussion about that. Came up repeatedly this evening. And now we live in a world where we totally take it for granted. I mean, I remember when I was photographed as a child, I was put in a chair like that with a clamp in the back of my head. I think I was 5 years old. And I still remember that. And now, my children have already taken hundreds of photographs, and my grandchildren, probably thousands of photographs. And my older brother was pointing out, he thinks that photography will really be devalued because the mystery is gone. Because I have this book about the history of magic, and it ends up with the section that introduces photography. So photography is really an extension of the history of magic. And so now we live with this magic that has been totally, we live almost in fear of it. It's not something that amuses us. We all feel like potentially now we're being caught in a crime. And so sort of trying to bring it into the present, if I may.
Yeah, certainly. I think.
What does that mean?
What does that? That's a big question. I mean, one interesting point you raise is just the kind of the way in which we are now identified in so many different ways, and I think something that came up as I was researching this exhibition and getting into questions of the role of facial recognition technology, for example, and it's being used now without, obviously, people's explicit permission. It's being tested by a lot of police departments in a kind of dubiously ethical way in a lot of major metropolitan places. There's also that, now it's no longer necessary to have any kind of criminal record in order to have your face in the facial recognition network that's overseen by the FBI and is essentially a kind of conglomeration of all of the different ID photos that exist, people's passport photos. And so in a strange way now, they've all kind of entered into a common terrain by the sort of commonality and standardization of the format in which they're created. And so it's now possible, for example, for the police in any precinct in the US to create what they call virtual lineups, where they can use your ID photo or a passport photo to create a criminal lineup when they're trying to get a witness to, select someone. So there has been this kind of blurring, I think, certainly between those different types of, I guess, identification and juridical portraiture, which I think is something that is going to become increasingly problematic, but also hard to control now that 1 and 2 Americans is part of the facial recognition network here. I don't know if you guys had any thoughts about the modern incarnations of the mugshot.
Video.
Other than the fact that if it's 50%, half of this crowd
At
has
least.
a mugshot out there, if you want to call it that. I mean, maybe there needs to be a redefinition of what that is.
A new term, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
No, I appreciate hearing that. I think it's really interesting.
I think we are out of time officially. So thanks again, Luc, Dennis, Arne. Really appreciate you coming here tonight, and thank you everybody for sticking around.